Forget about this big number on Wall Street. America's worrying about even bigger numbers on Main Street. Pump prices surging over 11% just this year alone. Grocery bills soaring 5% from this same time last year. Now, some corporate profits are taking a beating amid signs consumers are feeling the pinch. Will it be jobs taking a beating next? Hi, everyone. I'm Brenda Buttner. This is Bulls and Bears. Let's get right to it. The Bulls and Bears this week, we've got Gary B. Smith, Tobin Smith, Jonas Max Ferris, along with Todd Schoenberger and Mike Norman. Welcome to everybody. So, Todd, will soaring prices lead to soaring layoffs?
They will, Brenda. Look, it's a simple lesson in Economics 101. When you're spending more money for life's necessities, such as food, which you said were up 5% in a year, you're going to have less money for other items, and therefore corporate profits will take a hit. That leaves corporations with two options. One, you can pass the rising costs on to consumers, which we're already seeing, or you simply start laying off people. So we have to be prepared.
Well, Gary B., Safeway, we've seen that with Safeway, but a lot of times in a recession, companies will just, their margins will shrink and they won't pass them along. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that will be the case this time. Look, I respect Todd's macro views. And just to kind of confirm or deny that, I went back through the history tracking unemployment rate versus the CPI index, basically measuring inflation. And I could find no correlation. In fact, in a couple instances, in the early 50s and the mid 70s, we had very high inflation and the unemployment rate was very low. Now, I'm not saying that's always going to happen. And we'll, as inflation perks up now, if it perks up, we'll see, a dip in unemployment. But I don't think they're correlated. So I don't think you can just make a blanket statement. That's what we'll see this time.
Okay, Toby. Pressure on companies, pressure on retailers, pressure on suppliers. What does that do for jobs?
It cuts jobs, but at the part of the cycle we're in right now, we've had all the investment we've seen. We've seen $1 trillion of investment in improving productivity. That's been done. Now we have an opportunity, or essentially the problem, that a company can't sort of add and buy more productivity here. So that since 70% of normal costs are labor, that is where you now go into I can't buy a machine, now I have to lay off labor. So there is no question that it is mostly correlated, particularly, forget about the 70s, Gary. Those are old-time economics. Today, all the dollars and the buying and the selling is all computerized.
But Jonas, labor costs, if we're talking specifically about labor costs, they still remain low.
Right. That's the major cost that Toby just said. Yeah. That's a major cost. Until labor costs start to rise, you're not going to see a major problem with firing people. In fact, labor costs are rising lower rates than inflation, not as much as energy, not as much as food. There's more inflation than labor cost inflation, and that's ultimately what drives your labor costs. In addition to that, a lot of companies, they didn't add a lot. That's why we have a high unemployment rate. They just did overtime. So there's not like they added all these people with a 5% unemployment rate today, and now they got to let them go because the economy gets a little hiccuped. There's a lot of people working overtime who they could ease back on without firing them. So we're not going to see unemployment rise just because consumer prices may rise a little bit. Watch labor costs. That's what you want to say.
Well, what do you think, Mike? Do you think we're going to see more pink slips out of all this inflation?
With all due respect to Toby, it's not old-time economics. It's the same economics, and I have to agree with Gary B. Smith because, while consumers are paying higher prices, somebody's earning that additional income, okay? It all stays within the economy, so it doesn't necessarily automatically equate to layoffs. I mean, if you look back, as he mentioned, and over periods of time when we had rising prices, which the most recent one was the 2007 to 2008 period, we had an increase in payrolls. We had decline in unemployment. So until the point when maybe if it results in a recession, and, it's hard to call.
It's at the expense of human capital,
though,
Mike.
Problematic. But right now, it all stays within the economy.
You have to show earnings growth, though, Mike, and you're not going to see that if your overhead costs are high.
No, because earnings are at an all-time record high, and it has not really resulted in any boom in employment. So,
only
the causation
of
is
S&P
different.
500 companies
you got it
feed on that
backwards.
bottom
Hold on.
line.
Not that.
Okay, go ahead, Todd. Make your point.
Look, here, when you start looking at earnings, you have to suspect that corporations have only two options right now. Remember, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. That's who they're looking out for. At the expense of human capital, which is sad to say, they will be cutting off people. Look, you saw that with Cisco. Cisco actually saw their numbers dip. They always experienced double-digit earnings growth, and they had to lay off 30,000 people.
Todd, some companies, are earning that income as a result of higher prices. It stays within, in the aggregate, it doesn't change. It just shifts from one sector of the economy to another. That's all.
So what's that mean to jobs, Toby?
Well, with all due respect to Mike,
come on, forget all this respect, guys. What happened to bulls and bears?
He's bigger than me. There's a bigger issue here, which is that obviously jobs in the private sector, the public sector are already being cut right now because of lowering expenses, and those people are not finding new jobs. The reason why they're not is they're not trained to do the stuff that we're doing in the private sector. Part of the private sector job is there's some areas of this world, particularly in energy, they can't find enough people. But for the vast majority, we have this misallocation of people, and the people that are getting fired are not just fungibly, Mike, going into somebody else's job because they don't have
what's that have to do with inflation?
That has to do with weak demand in general. I mean,
well, you can't have it both ways. I mean, you can't have it both ways. The
economy's growing. So that's a positive.
2% is not big growth.
It's about 3%.
And remember that Remember the 50 more percent of the actual earnings from these large corporations are from overseas. That's where they're actually adding people. Here's where they're cutting back.
Okay, you look amazed, Gary B. Come on, what do you think?
No. I'm not amazed. Mike made the key point. Let's just use, you saw in the opening graphic Safeway. Safeway is facing higher costs, not all of which they're able to pass on to the consumer. So say they face higher costs for canned goods or avocados. Who gets that higher prices? The avocado producers and the canned goods. So they get more revenue to them, and they're able to hire more workers. That's Mike's point. That's why the inflation is not necessarily correlated to the employment rate.
Using that logic, though, Gary B., then say they eliminate that product, then it's that farmer over there who's producing that can of goods, then they have to start laying off people. That's the ripple effect, the ancillary effect of higher prices.
But then Safeway spends money in another area. They don't just go from 20,000 SKUs to 10,000
You're
SKUs.
Assuming
they replace it.
It's pure assumption.
All right, boys and girls, we're a little deep in the weeds here. The average American is saying to himself or herself, exactly. And the average American is saying, "Look, my prices are going. They know that the corporations don't feel it because we've had no gains in costs to their employees. Well, we've now hit that point that if their costs can't get passed through, they can only do one thing, and that's lower their overhead."
If you look, the Safeway customer doesn't know their prices go up. That's the point I think Gary's making, is that they're eating some of these costs. There is a healthy margin,
pardon the pun,
point, at the profit level for corporations. They have a little bit of margin to eat some of these rising costs. I will say there is a point where all these rising costs doesn't lead to profits. If it's just generalized inflation where the Federal Reserve is trying to keep unemployment low and generating really high inflation, much higher than we're seeing now, at that point it stops becoming profits for everybody and becomes a real problem for the economy and the stock market. We're just not there yet.
Companies that got over their fear of firing, guys, in 08, 09, they fired people. They never thought they could do it. People are a lot quicker to fire than they were before.
No, but Jonas is saying we're getting to that point.
We're
just not there yet. Is that what
presumably the Federal Reserve
to?
would stop the juice if it sees it getting out of control, but they are trying to engineer low unemployment. It hasn't worked that well yet, at the cost of a little inflation. That's kind of what the balance is with the Federal Reserve, always has been. Sometimes they screw it up and it doesn't work and you get inflation and high unemployment.
Okay.
We haven't had that yet.
That's got to be the last word, and that does it.